It feels weird to call a medium format camera affordable, but that really is the easiest way to describe the Fujifilm GFX 100S2. It's the least expensive 100 megapixel medium format camera that you can walk into a camera store and buy brand new. Otherwise, you're looking at something like a GFX 50 or going with something used. Otherwise, you have to step up to the full-size GFX or a Hasselblad X2D, which is going to cost you $2,500 or $3,000+ more than what this camera would cost you. Last year, I took the GFX 102, so the full-size version of this camera, to Iceland with me and got some hands-on experience with medium format for the first time. Now, this camera doesn't belong to me, it belongs to Fujifilm, and I do have to send it back. Unfortunately, I was only able to keep it for about a week, so this is going to be a very brief, high-level overview with some of the similarities between those two cameras, but some of the things that make this camera different and maybe why you might want to consider it, or what type of photography this camera would be good for, or what type of photographer should invest in a system like this. At a really high level, both the GFX 102 and the S model have the same sensor. So in terms of the quality of photos that you're going to get, it's going to be the same. They're both medium format, they're both 100 megapixels, and they're both capable of shooting 16-bit RAW files. The ISO range, the sensitivity of the sensor on both of those cameras is the same, and the modes that are available are the same on both of these cameras. One of the big differences that I noticed right away was the lack of customizable buttons. So the full-size Fuji GFX 102 has 2 extra buttons down here and 3 extra buttons on the top that I actually used quite a lot when I had the original GFX 102. And so that was a little bit missing. I really do wish I had those 3 buttons to just program them to maybe like change the autofocus mode or just have those quick options available when you're switching between different subjects. The burst drive mode on the S model is a little bit slower. So if you're trying to shoot a moving subject, kind of like what I was doing here when we were shooting this Cadillac Escalade, I found that I was hitting the limit of what this camera was capable of. Also, because the buffer on this camera is not as big. With the S model, you're looking at between 16 and 26 RAW photos, depending on the compression method, before the buffer fills up. Compared to the non-S model, you're gonna get between 76 and 390 RAW photos. So that is a significant difference. Now, the other thing is that the S model only uses SD cards. So it has 2 slots, like the regular version, but they're both SD cards. So the full-size non-S version has 1 SD card and 1 CF Express Type B card. Now, that affects some of the movie shooting abilities, and I believe, if I have my information correct, the S model doesn't do 8K. So if you're interested in this camera for the 8K high resolution video modes, then you're probably gonna wanna shell out a little bit of extra money and go with the larger camera. There are also big differences in the electronic viewfinder. So the S model has a lower resolution viewfinder. I think it's around 500,000 or like 500,000 dots, whereas the non-S model has around 900,000, so close to 1,000,000 dots, and you do notice it. It's maybe not a big deal if you're someone who tends to use the back screen a little bit, because I do believe the resolution of both of the screens are the same. I personally feel like the non-S model, the screen on it looks a little bit better, even though technically they do have the same amount of resolution, but it might just be a placebo effect because I'm using a camera that is technically on paper less expensive. But the advantage of the S model is because it doesn't have all of those extra components and all of the extra weight to it, is it is a lighter camera. The non-S model has that removable viewfinder, it's taller, it's larger. The advantage with the removable viewfinder is, of course, that you can take it off and store it. But if you're someone who's like, well, I don't want that, I'm never going to take it off, I don't want to lose that piece, then going with the S model, it is a little bit more compact. Now, if I have the specs correct, the eye relief on the non-S model, so the full-size model, is also a little bit better. So that's kind of like the distance to where you put your eye and you can kind of get your eye in the viewfinder. Again, maybe not the biggest difference in the world if you're someone who's just wanting to get into medium format cameras and maybe doesn't care about all those little extra utilities. But for me, when I look at this camera, the main use case is going to be more of a prosumer user. So someone who wants a high-end camera but maybe isn't doing studio work, or maybe someone who already has a GFX and wants another one as a backup, because maybe you don't need 8 photos per second and 7 photos per second is good enough. Or you don't need all of those extra buttons and you're maybe a little bit of a slower paced shooter because you like to shoot landscapes and you don't need all of that extra functionality. Another thing too is if you are someone shooting in a fast paced environment, the full size GFX has more autofocus points. So I believe the S model has around 117 autofocus points, whereas the non-S GFX 102 has, I think, over 400 autofocus points. So that is a significant difference. And again, something I noticed when we were shooting these burst photos of this Cadillac driving down the fall road. But in terms of how I use this camera, I did use it with 2 different lenses. So these are the exact same lenses that I used last year with the GFX 102. So this is the 110 millimeter. This is kind of what I think like a 70 millimeter equivalent on full frame. And then the main lens that I pretty much shot all of the photos on was this 32 to 64. So you can kind of think of this as a 24 to 70 equivalent. It's not exactly equivalent, but in terms of the types of photos that you would capture, this is an f4 lens in terms of the aperture, and so that would be comparable to like an f2.8 on a regular full frame camera. And for me personally, if I was to buy this system and invest in this system, this is the combo that I would go with. I would start with a 32 to 64, and then as I progressed and I decided what types of photos I was interested, I would then maybe expand into some of the prime lenses like the 55 millimeter or the 110 millimeter. But you can see this is the sample gallery of all of the photos that I shot, or at least some of the select photos. And having 16-bit, this is where things get really interesting. So these sunset photos here are a good example of what I would want to use a GFX system and its 16-bit RAW files for. So when we look at a sunset condition, we do have quite a range of gradation. So the gradient from this portion of the sky where it's blue to this portion of the sky where it's orange. With more bits of information, you have more ability to edit and pull out tonality from this image. So if I start to push and pull this where I'm gonna bring back maybe some of the shadows, I'm gonna bring down the highlights to really reveal that gradient. Again, we can only do so much with the sun. The sun is insanely bright. So even if I drag this all the way down, you can see the limits of the dynamic range here, but I am underexposed on this image. So if I start to pull it up and we look at maybe some of the black detail, you can see, okay, yeah, we do have noise in there, even though I'm at ISO 100. But again, if we go back to the original photo, you can see how dark it was. So of course there are going to be limits with how much we can push and pull this photo. But if I bring it back to around here, where I would consider this to be an acceptable edit, this looks really awesome. Like the gradient, the color, everything I'm getting in the sky with this medium format camera looks awesome. I can do the same thing with this photo. If I start to push and pull it, you can see I'm maintaining all those colors in the sky. And again, with medium format, because these files are so large, between 100 and 200 megabytes each, you're not going to be firing off 10 photos of this sunset. You're probably going to shoot 1 or 2 or an extra one vertical and an extra one horizontal, and that's the photo that you're going to edit. And you can see with a lot of the photos that I've edited in this video, I've actually used my Lightroom presets. Now, if you have a ton of photos to edit, you can't always go in and tweak every single one. But what you can do is you can start with the basic adjustments: exposure, white balance, highlights, and shadows. And once you've gotten that photo to the point where you're happy with it, you can throw in a preset. In fact, that's what I do with probably 2/3, 75% of the edits that I do. I simply don't have time to sit down and edit every single one from scratch. There are some signature looks that I've created over the last 2 years specifically that I've compiled into my Division 2 Lightroom preset pack. And if you haven't checked it out, my presets are linked down in the description. You get 18 unique looks, 36 presets in total because there are 2 versions of each. It comes with installation tutorials on how to use presets and what happens if you get stuck, and even some raw sample files. One of them that was actually captured on the GFX 102 during my trip to Iceland last December. So if you're interested in saving time during your editing, you can check out my presets linked down in the description below. This photo is a good example of what I'd want to use a GFX camera for. Not only because it's medium format camera, but also because it has 16-bit and all of that flexibility when it comes to editing. Now, with car photography, typically you're looking at the details in the headlights as the brightest point in your image, and you want to preserve that, which is why this image is a little bit underexposed, because I didn't want to lose all of that detail. So if I was to edit this, I would up the exposure and then start playing around maybe with some of the shadows. Now, the challenge here is that I'm dealing with a car that is, it's black. Cadillac calls it their metallic gray color, but essentially it's absorbing all of the light in this photo. And so I'm gonna start masking and I'm gonna start pushing and pulling those highlights to really get this to the point where I'm happy with it. And once I'm happy with it, I'm then gonna go through and probably start to play with some of my presets. Ranger Green is a good one here, maybe Rustic Dawn. Thunderbird is one that always looks good, but really any of these will do. And what you can see is that we've gone from something that maybe looks a little bit underexposed, but because I shot it intentionally retaining those highlights on a system that I know can handle all of that dynamic range and all of that bit depth, I'm able to pull out a really great looking photo. So if you're looking for a camera that is maybe a little bit of a step up, maybe a little bit something that's premium compared to a full frame camera, or you just want something that has that medium format camera look, that 100 megapixel resolution, and that 16-bit depth of flexibility when it comes to editing, the GFX 100 is a really great option to consider. But if you want to see me shoot with more medium format cameras, more on the GFX system, or more with Fujifilm cameras, let me know down in the comments below. And until the next one, get out, grab your camera, and go shoot photos.